leading New York radical, recalled Hamilton after these great writings became our oracle. Through his writing, Hamilton became the patriot leader he had claimed to be. When a local newspaper condemned President Cooper for his British loyalties, an angry mob of Liberty Boys, the militant fringe of pre-revolutionary New York, marched on Cooper's house. When the mob smashed through the college's front gate, Hamilton awoke to see the torch-carrying rebel. He dashed toward the presidential mansion, dragging troop behind, pushed his way through the crowd, and hurled himself onto Cooper's front porch, placing his body between Cooper and the mob. Trooper called that in an effort to save Cooper. Hamilton spoke with great animation and eloquence. He did harangue the mob on the excessive impropriety of their conduct and the disgrace they would bring to the cause of liberty. Cooper's porch became at once Hamilton's stage and bully pulpit. Cooper could not hear Hamilton because his windows were closed, but seeing his student on the porch, he mistakenly thought that he was leading the lynch mob. Just as Hamilton was pleading for Cooper's life, Cooper raised his window and yelled to the crowd, "Don't mind what he says. He's crazy," which brought on gales of laughter. The delay allowed Cooper time to escape out the back door and onto a British ship, never again to be seen on American soil. The Liberty Boys were impressed with Hamilton's mettle and included him in their most daring raid, an attempt to steal British cannon from the battery in Lower Manhattan. On August 23, 1775, they planned to drag these guns, weighing tons and resting on squeaky old wheels, uphill from Bowling Green to Wall Street. To add an extra degree of difficulty, these old cannon sat a few feet across the water from a massive 34-gun British warship, the Asia. Their only asset was the element of surprise, but the Liberty Boys made such a loud racket that their mission was not secret for long. The Asia's captain paused, assuming that the hooligans would desist once they realized they had been detected. When they did not, he opened fire with all 34 guns. The massive explosion sent everyone fleeing, with the exception of Hamilton, who continued patiently dragging his cannon up the hill, handing his rifle to a fleeing companion for safekeeping. At the top, his friend Hercules Mulligan sheepishly admitted that he had dropped Hamilton's gun while running for cover. To Mulligan's amazement, Hamilton turned back toward the wall of exploding cannons, walked calmly down the hill, and retrieved his weapon, with as much unconcern as if the vessel were not there. Reported the astonished Mulligan. Hamilton had nerve. He wasn't so much brave as unafraid. As with most hypomanics, the meaning of risk simply failed to register with him emotionally. The daring raid of the Liberty Boys would be for naught. The Provincial Congress of New York was embarrassed by this attempt to provoke the British. There was, as yet, no declared war. Local pride, however, would not allow the guns to be returned. As a compromise, they were left where they were, uselessly stranded in the town square where they looked, according to one local, as conspicuous as a herd of elephants. In that light, the situation took on the comic aspect of a college prank. Hamilton aspired to be more than a Liberty Boy. Two newly appointed generals in the inchoate Continental Army asked Hamilton to be their assistant. He refused them both. His ambition was to captain his own artillery company, and he achieved his aim, breezing through the gunnery exam after a long weekend of cramming. His first day of command was a rude shock. The young collegian faced an unruly group of ruffians with no skill no discipline, no uniforms, and a lousy fife and drum corps. Hamilton quickly took command. He discharged a few insubordinates, recruited better musicians, and spent the final installment of his funds from St. Croix outfitting his men in a fashion that made them Yankee Doodle dandies indeed. An advertisement for the return of a deserter from Hamilton's company stated that he had last been seen cheaply dressed in a deep blue coat turned up with a buff, a pair of leather breeches, and a new felt hat. For himself, Hamilton bought even finer duds, including a three-cornered hat, a blue swallowtail coat with skinny brass buttons, and striking white pants. Hamilton drilled his troops mercilessly, with indefatigable pains, as Troop recalled. He estimated that Hamilton's company was esteemed the most beautiful model of discipline in the whole army. There wasn't much competition among the ragtag ad hoc militia. Just by having uniforms, they stood out, which of course was Hamilton's intention. Hypomanics are driven to call attention to themselves. They crave attention, not only for the considerable pleasure it brings them, but because one must be noticed to advance. Then Hamilton got his childhood wish. There was a war, and in 1776 it came to him. Washington's boy. Washington's Continental Army flooded into New York City in the spring of 1776. Hamilton's company was engulfed and annexed by the larger force, and Hamilton came under Washington's command. Washington's first review of the troops was on May 15th. All companies mustered on a field for inspection. As Hamilton had hoped, the snap, energy, and precision of his men caught Washington's attention. He assigned Hamilton command of the guns at Fort George at the lower tip of Manhattan. Day and night Hamilton stood next to his cannons, looking out over the water and scanning the British warships. Washington expected the British fleet to sail right toward him. Hamilton commanded the front line in the impossible defense of New York. On August 7th, 110 warships emerged out of the fog. The slow, majestic stampede of floating mammoths was terrifyingly beautiful. Huge white sails puffing gracefully, wide brown bodies cutting proudly through the water, bright cannons gleaming, Union Jacks flying. More and more they kept coming and coming until they filled the entire horizon, and they didn't fire a shot. The American militia was but a pack of flies to them. One warship had more firepower than Washington's entire army. They silently turned north and sailed unmolested up the Hudson. Faced with this stunning display of power, the rebels could do little but watch, with the exception of Hamilton, who yelled, "Fire!" The very idea that his few guns could even scratch the most massive armada the world had ever seen was entirely irrational. They didn't land a single blow against the enemy. But 4 of his own men were killed when one of their own cannon blew up. The gun probably hadn't been fired since the French and Indian War. The Continental Army began to realize with sickening horror the overwhelming size of the force it was facing. It was defending a city surrounded by water against the most powerful navy in the world. And unless rowboats counted, it didn't have a single ship. At first, the Continentals tried desperately to hold the American fortifications in Brooklyn Heights. Washington saved his army from total destruction only by quietly evacuating his troops in rowboats across the East River into Manhattan one moonless night. Had he not escaped, the war would have been over on its first day. Washington learned from his mistakes and began leading his troops like the guerrilla army they were. On Christmas night, Washington and his troops quietly crossed the Delaware River in small craft in a blinding snowstorm. Hamilton crossed with him, steadying his cannon in the icy boat. They took 2,000 hungover Hessians in Trenton by surprise. General Charles Cornwallis then led a British force to Trenton on a retaliatory raid. When Cornwallis went out looking for the revolutionaries, Washington doubled back and attacked the English headquarters at the College of New Jersey in Princeton. Legend has it that Hamilton fired a cannonball that decapitated a portrait of the King of England. After these two minor victories, Hamilton was euphoric. The dawning of that bright day broke forth with such resplendent luster. He wrote with his irrational, hypomanic optimism. Hamilton seemed to believe that they had practically finished off the British. Such is the present situation that another Trenton affair will amount to a complete victory on our part, for they are too low on ebb to bear another stroke of that kind. Such an assessment was beyond overconfident. It was absurd. The revolutionaries had embarrassed the British but done no real damage to their forces. After this exhilarating victory, Hamilton collapsed into a long and dangerous illness. He would periodically break down physically after superhuman exertions of energy into illness or an exhausted funk. While still recovering, in January 1777, Hamilton received what has been called the letter, an invitation from George Washington to serve as one of his aides de camp. It was this relationship that made Hamilton a founder. Washington's team of assistants was a special breed, bright, ambitious young men eager to risk their lives for fame. A pretty hypomanic lot. For example, the Marquis de Lafayette, a French nobleman descended from 10 generations of soldiers, ran away from his family to fight in the Revolution. He threatened to burn his own ship when it appeared that it might be captured by the British before crossing the Atlantic. When first touching American soil, he uttered an oath to conquer or perish in the cause. "You asked me when I first longed for glory," he wrote in his memoir. "I can recall no time when I did not love stories of glorious deeds or have dreams of traveling the world in search of fame." Young men of such ambitions made up Washington's staff. The aides slept together every night, like a pack of bloodhounds on the floor, or two or three to a bed, in the homes and farmhouses that served as their temporary quarters. They called themselves a band of brothers and found kindred spirits in one another. Though from vastly diverse backgrounds, they shared the same genetic temperament. This was the closest thing to a family Hamilton had ever had, biographer Roger Kennedy told me. And Washington ran his camp like a family, addressing his aides as "my boy." Washington, who had never had any biological children, sublimated his paternal drives towards his beardless boys. In turn, Washington's aides worshipped him. One might think that Hamilton, the orphan, would have been eager to bask in Washington's paternal warmth, but Hamilton was deeply conflicted. Most of his fellow aides, whose backgrounds were less troubled, responded early to this overwhelming paternalism. From a psychodynamic perspective, a good father figure was a terrifying prospect for a young man who had learned to deny such longings. He was drawn to it, but he feared it. Hamilton defensively claimed that he had no need for fatherly love and said he consciously cultivated an air of distance in his relationship to the commander-in-chief. For 3 years past, I have felt no friendship for him and have professed none. The part of my temper would not suffer me to profess what I did not feel. Indeed, when advances of this kind have been made to me on his part, they were received in a manner that showed at least I had no inclination to court them, and that I wished to stand rather upon a footing of military confidence than of private attachment. As they moved from place to place, Washington and his aides stayed in the homes of private families, often wealthy ones who had sufficient room. Evenings might be spent in competitive banter. Hamilton thrived in this atmosphere. Meanwhile, nights offered competition of a different sort. Hamilton was notorious for being successful in betting the ladies. His hypersexual behavior was apparent to those who knew him. Martha Washington, who witnessed some of Hamilton's conquests when staying with the general in camp, made a slight reference to him that them when she named a tomcat impregnating all the local females. Hamilton. The puritanical John Adams was offended by Hamilton's unspeakable debaucheries and audacious and unblushing attempts upon ladies of the highest rank and purest virtue. Adams seriously wondered if Hamilton's overweening ambition was caused by a superabundance of secretions which he could not find enough whores to draw off. Though Hamilton married Elizabeth Schuyler during the Revolution, the bonds of matrimony couldn't contain his sexual appetites. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton would become the subject of the government's first sex scandal. Hamilton rose to become Washington's de facto chief of staff. One could hardly think of a more important position for a young man from nowhere, but Hamilton was frustrated. He longed to distinguish himself in battle. He had wished for war. Here it was, and he was missing it, chained to the dead wood. Many times Hamilton implored Washington for a combat command, and every time he was turned down. The commander-in-chief made the judgment that he needed his talented chief aide at headquarters, even if Hamilton was jumping out of his skin, itching for action. In the Battle of Monmouth, Hamilton finally got his chance. After months of hiding from his superior enemy, Washington finally planned to attack the Redcoats. As protocol would dictate, the attack was to be led by his most senior-ranking general, Charles Lee. An eccentric character, Lee said he disapproved of the entire operation and declined the command. Hamilton was delighted. Command then passed to Hamilton's camp brother, General Lafayette, who would surely include him. But even as the Marquis, in raptures with his command and burning to distinguish himself, was being congratulated, Lee reappeared to rescind his refusal, ending the celebration. Then Lee changed his mind again, and yet again. Finally, Washington grew tired of such fickle behavior and told Lafayette to proceed. He chose Hamilton as his principal aide. Our personal honor is at stake, Hamilton wrote to Washington. Lafayette and Hamilton rode out together in the morning. They spent the day spying on British troops, moving men, and communicating with headquarters and each other. Just as the operation began to unfold, Lafayette received a discouraging letter from Washington. Lee's uneasiness at having refused command was increasing rather than abating. Incredibly, Washington was giving Lee yet another chance to lead the attack. Just as it was being launched, Hamilton and Lafayette's personal adventure was over. But under Lee's ambivalent leadership, the attack dissolved into a chaotic retreat. After his last-minute insistence on leading the attack, Lee once again reverted to his initial instincts and refused to attack on Washington's order. Washington is reputed to have sworn so hard he shook leaves from the trees. Washington, Lafayette, and Hamilton worked together frantically to regain control and avoid a rout. When General Lee seemed to be retreating, Hamilton rode to the scene in great heat and confronted the general. To the contrary, Lee insisted he would be the last man to abandon the hill he was defending. Hamilton jumped off his horse, drew his sword, and proclaimed that no one was to retreat. Neither he nor Lee would abandon the hill. I will stay here with you, my dear general, and die with you. Let us all die rather than retreat. We will die here on this spot.